at hyperpigmentation, we're really looking at today the science of how melanin is created and what that process looks like in the skin. I am a big believer of, if you understand the science, if you get to the nitty-gritty, then when you zoom back out and look at your whole treatment, everything falls together and it makes sense. Everything just clicks a little bit better. So like Celeste said, I'll try to answer questions as we go through. Please feel free to chat them into the Q&A. Anything I don't answer as we go through, we'll do a Q&A session at the end. And this is a lot of information, so there might be some questions. So as an overview of what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about, well, first, we're actually going to recap how pigmentation is formed. So we're going to do a quick overview of just the step-by-step process of melanogenesis, which is the process of creating melanin in our skin, how our skin gets its color. And then we're going to zoom in and break down the nitty-gritty aspects of that. So we're going to start with melanocyte signaling. If that doesn't sound familiar, we will break it down. It's basically what flips the on switch for creating pigmentation, and how can we maybe control it and turn it off to control the hyperpigmentation. We're also going to look at the science importance of tyrosinase, which is a familiar word if you're familiar with a lot of hyperpigmentation products. We will talk about what that is and why it is so integral to understand to get really good results treating pigmentation. Excuse me. We're also going to look at the two types of melanin that your skin creates, Eumelanin and pheomelanin, and how those processes differ a little bit and how that changes our skin color. We're also going to look at melanosome development. So we'll talk about melanosomes in a moment. They're the little packages that your melanin lives in. All melanin lives in a package in your skin. And we're actually going to break down how those packages form and how the melanin fits in. And then the ultimate goal for all of these things is, once we understand the science, how do we then use all that information to go back to the treatment room? Now, we can't cover, of course, everything in an hour of what to take back to the treatment room. So that's where you're going to want to look for that new upcoming hyperpigmentation course that's going to be coming from IDI later this year. So we're going to scratch at the surface a little bit today. So let's start with an overview of what melanogenesis is and how it happens. So if you look at the image that's on the right-hand side of the screen, what you're seeing is, excuse me, my allergies are bothering me today. What you're seeing is a melanocyte, and the melanocyte is the cell that's responsible for creating pigment in the skin. If you look at the shape, I like to kind of think of it shaped like a hand. You've got that big cell body and then these little finger-like projections that come off of it. So when this happens, the first thing that happens is you have to have melanin, which is created in the body of the cell, starting in the nucleus of the cell, actually. There are two types of melanin that are going to be created there, and we're going to follow that life cycle to see how that happens. Now, we also have melanin that is synthesized within the melanosomes. So those of you who may have taken some hyperpigmentation classes before, we often say we make melanin and then we package it and then it gets delivered to the skin cells. That's kind of a breakdown of it, but the melanin is actually created inside the melanosome package. So that's something we don't always talk about in classes, and we're going to deep dive on that today. So those two types of melanin are created within those packages. And then the melanosomes kind of get delivered down those finger-like projections. Think of those finger-like projections, which are called dendrites. Those dendrites are delivery routes. The melanin has to be delivered down those delivery routes into your skin cell. After the skin cell receives the delivery, then your 28-day cell turnover process begins. So this is a long process for our skin to receive its color. So this is important to remember, that step-by-step process that happens, because we ultimately want to understand each step a little better, or a lot better. And then we want to kind of hack the system and undo some of those steps, because this is kind of all like dominoes falling over. The melanin is created in the package is delivered, the package is opened by the skin cells. So if we can start pulling some of those dominoes out of the chain, we can reduce the amount of hyperpigmentation. So that's the kind of big zoom out version. Now we're going to start to zoom in a little bit and figure out exactly how this process works, because that was a very basic overview, and we're going to deep dive a little bit. The first thing that has to happen with hyperpigmentation is the melanocyte has to be signaled. Now remember, we said the melanocyte was that cell that was kind of like your hand. All of melanin manufacturing happens here. However, it doesn't just spontaneously happen when you get hyperpigmentation. Something has to send a message to the melanocyte to increase the amount of melanin that it's creating. So if you look at the image on the left, I'm actually going to circle for you a receptor that lives on the outside of the melanocyte, and that's called MC1R. The job of MC1R is to take signals in and tell the melanocyte what to do. So let's say you're outside and you're tanning and you're getting a lot of UV exposure. The UV triggers that MC1R receptor to turn on, which then increases the amount of melanin that your skin is creating to try to protect you from the UV. So that MC1R is going to be important. That's what turns on the melanocyte to create hyperpigmentation. So already you're probably thinking, okay, well, how do I turn it off to get rid of the hyperpigmentation? Let's break down a couple different ways that it's turned on so we can then go and try to hack that system to undo it a little bit. So there's a couple ways that the MC1R can be activated, and it has to do with a signaling molecule binding to the receptor. We will break this down a little bit more in a moment as well. The first signaling molecule that comes in is called alpha MSH, and MSH stands for melanocyte stimulating hormone. And it does exactly what it sounds like. It's a hormone that stimulates the melanocyte. So what you can see right at that red circle there where we have that MC1R, alpha MSH, so that melanocyte stimulating hormone, is binding to the receptor. Once it's bound, the receptor switches on and that pigmentation process starts to begin. So that's one way that we can start the pigmentation process. The other way is called Agouti signaling protein, or ASP. So this one also will bind to that MC1R receptor, but when it does, it actually creates a different type of melanin. And we will look at that as well and kind of break down why we have different skin colors and how the signaling is different. Alpha MSH stimulates eumelanin, which is actually the darker form of melanin. We're going to break that down much more. We're actually going to look at melanin under a microscope in a few minutes. So eumelanin is darker melanin. It's shades of browns and blacks. So this is what you'll typically find in your higher Fitzpatrick clients. Pheomelanin is the lighter, smaller melanin. This is what you'll usually find in your fair skin clients, maybe Fitzpatrick 1 and 2. So alpha MSH stimulates eumelanin, the brown shades of melanin, and ASP, the Agouti signaling protein, signals the pheomelanin production, and that's actually shades of reds and yellows, the lighter colors. So different signals create different color melanin. So if we know that's what turns it on, we kind of want to understand how that process is happening so that we can slow it and only have the process create our natural skin color and not the hyperpigmentation. So any area that's darker than your natural skin color is considered hyperpigmentation. Now, we can't change your natural skin color. We don't want to do that. That's ingrained in your DNA. Your body is always making that. So when we talk about hyperpigmentation, it's this signaling that's sending it into overdrive. Now you have those darkened areas of the skin. That's the hyperpigmentation. So last part of signaling before we dive a little bit deeper. When that signal binds, whether it's the alpha MSH, which is again the darker eumelanin, or the ASP, which is the lighter pheomelanin, that kickstarts the production of an enzyme called tyrosinase. And remember, we said that was super important with pigmentation. Tyrosinase is naturally created by our skin, and it's an integral part of creating melanin. I like to think of it as an ingredient in the recipe for melanin. You have to have tyrosinase as an ingredient or we cannot create melanin. It's kind of like if you were going to go bake a cake and you ran out of flour, you're not baking a cake. We can't do it. So we need to know about tyrosinase so we can figure out how do we remove that ingredient so that way we can slow the production of melanin. So we'll look at how tyrosinase specifically contributes to skin color and melanin production. So tyrosinase, remember we said, starts to be created once that melanocyte is signaled. This is the kickstart for the creation of melanin. All colors of melanin, no matter how light or how dark, all start with tyrosinase. That's really important to know because if you use ingredients that are tyrosinase inhibitors, they're going to work for all clients of all skin colors because this tyrosinase equation is the same for everybody, no matter what your skin color is. So this is the catalyst for the synthesis of melanin. So remember, we said this is the driving ingredient when we create melanin. However, tyrosinase on its own won't actually cause any kind of melanin to be created. It has to be activated in order for that melanin synthesis to start. Some people, fair-skinned people, have very inactive tyrosinase. It just doesn't activate that much, so we may not be creating as much melanin. In darker skin, we're creating a little bit more tyrosinase. It's more easily activated, so we might be creating a little bit more melanin. And we will come back to that as well. So the way that tyrosinase is activated is through a process called glycosylation. That's the addition of sugar molecules into the tyrosinase. The way I like to think of this is, imagine what happens. Some of you don't have to imagine. Some of you I saw in the chat are already chasing kids around at home. Imagine giving a small kid sugar. They're activated, they're hyper, they're running around, they have all this energy, and they're looking to play, they're looking for interaction. So take that concept and put that to glycosylation. It's the addition of sugar to an inactive molecule in the skin. So if you take tyrosinase, you activate it with sugar, it's active, it's exciting, it's running around, and it's looking for interaction. And that is the process that starts the melanin production. So tyrosinase plus sugar is going to be activated. And now when it starts looking for something to interact with, it finds tyrosine, which is an amino acid also naturally found in the skin. So once that tyrosinase is activated by sugar, it interacts with tyrosine. That's your melanin recipe. Once this activation and interaction occurs, the melanin process has begun. So already we're trying to weave in, how does this relate to my treatments? I inhibit the activity of tyrosinase. Maybe I try not to give it sugar. Maybe we want to reduce the amount of sugar in the body. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So this is the process that begins the melanin synthesis process. And remember, we said this is the same for every single person, no matter what your skin color is. So this is why we want to focus on inhibiting tyrosinase when we treat hyperpigmentation, because no matter the cause of the hyperpigmentation, whether it's UV induced or hormone induced, or maybe it's from old breakouts, this always starts the same way. So no matter the client, no matter the skin color, no matter the reason, tyrosinase inhibitors will be beneficial because it just reduces the amount of melanin we can create. So we mentioned already that tyrosinase is less active in clients with fair skin and more active in clients with darker skin. Tyrosinase also, like we said, it begins the process, but then that process will split and happen differently for clients with lighter skin and clients with darker skin. And that's what we're going to start to someone to look at so far. Now, I did see Sandra has a really good question in the chat. Would someone that has hypopigmentation not have tyrosinase? That's a really good question. So hypopigmentation is a complete lack of pigment in the skin. So if you've seen someone who is albino, albinism is when your melanocytes just do not function at all, no melanin is being created. If someone has vitiligo as well, and you get those patches of white, you can also see hypopigmentation just from excessive sun use or damage over time that has literally killed the melanocyte. So when you have hypopigmentation, it's not necessarily tyrosinase that's kind of the center of it. It's more of the melanocyte itself just no longer functions. That cell is dead, so it can't create any color. So now let's look at tyrosinase and how it creates these different types of melanin. Now, we're not that sciencey today. We have an hour. We're not going to go into the chemical structure of this, but we are going to use it as a visual. So if you look at the chemical structure that is highlighted in red, and we are going to add to this in a little bit, this is the beginning of hyperpigmentation. So tyrosinase in the middle, you can see that in red where those little brackets are, that has already been activated. So tyrosinase plus sugar, that glycosylation, it's activated, it's interacted with that tyrosine. That interaction creates a substance called dopaquinone, and this is the part that is exactly the same in every single person. So this is the part we want to interrupt. Now, if you look at the arrow on the side, alpha MSH, remember something has to signal for this to happen. If there's no signal, the melanocyte doesn't know to create any melanin. So the signal kickstarts this process. You got to send a signal first, then you have to activate tyrosinase, then it has to interact with tyrosine. Now, once this happens, there are two different pathways that can split into for the type of melanin we're created. There's a primary pathway that, if uninterrupted, every single one of us, our skin would do this just naturally. It's the primary pathway. We actually have to divert this and change it in order to get something different to happen. So the primary pathway is actually eumelanin for all of us. So alpha MSH, remember, stimulates eumelanin. That's the primary factor that's happening. We've got that tyrosinase equation happening. Then we divert down to the creation of eumelanin, which again is the primary pathway. Completely uninterrupted, all of us would have darker skin if there wasn't something interrupting this. So eumelanin is the primary pathway for every single one of us, which, by the way, also translates to hair color and eye color in a roundabout kind of way. So primary pathway is eumelanin, but not all of us have very dark skin. So what's happening? Because something obviously is diverting from this primary pathway if not all of us have rich brown skin. So what happens as the other pathway is a secondary pathway that leads to pheomelanin. Now, a couple different ways this can happen. We already mentioned the ASP, the AGT signaling protein, stimulates pheomelanin. When that happens, the biggest part I want you to look at when it comes to this big kind of chemical equation we have is the cysteine here in the middle that I just circled. The presence of cysteine diverts that entire pathway and starts to create pheomelanin. ASP creates cysteine. Once that cysteine exists, that melanin production starts to go sideways, and now we've gone down this secondary pathway. The other way this can happen is if the receptor has some kind of defect on it. So that MC1R primarily wants to create eumelanin, but if it's defective in some way, it's going to create pheomelanin instead. So if you're someone who has fairer skin, you may have a defect in your MC1R receptor. Now, is that a bad thing? No, of course not. It's just everyone's DNA is different. You just have one pathway your skin might favor more than the other one. And that defect is going to create cysteine. Again, cysteine creates pheomelanin. The other thing that happened is you could actually have a mutation on your MC1R, and this actually is something you can find in a DNA test, but you probably won't have to because I'll tell you what the mutations are. One of them, which is very relevant to us with treating hyperpigmentation, is an MC1R mutation could lead to genetic freckling. So if you have someone with a lot of freckles, I don't know how you can see on camera, but I have a face full of freckles. I have an MC1R defect, which means my skin is more likely to create freckling as hyperpigmentation. The second MC1R mutation is redheads, because remember we said this affects hair color too. So that's a fun fact for you. If you are technically a mutant, if you have freckles or red hair. So let's break this down again, and that'll go to questions because I do see some questions popping in. Remember, alpha MSH starts the entire signaling. That box in red, the tyrosinase equation, happens for everyone. Naturally and uninterrupted, we're going to go down that first pathway that creates eumelanin. If there is something that interrupts, if cysteine pops in for whatever reason, whether it's a defect or a different signal, we're going to go down that pheomelanin path. Now, most of us don't have just eumelanin or just pheomelanin. There's going to be a combination of both. And that's one of the reasons why we have such a variation of people's skin colors. We don't have two skin colors in the world. You can have any skin color and any tone. And that's partially because we have a mix of this eumelanin and pheomelanin, just depending on how the signal goes through. Now, I do want to check the Q&A for a quick second. I do see a longer question that I will come back towards at the end. So let's start breaking down these types of melanin a little bit more. Now we know how they're created. We now want to just figure out, well, what is the difference and why is it important? So the chart you're looking at now, on the left-hand side is the chemical structure of eumelanin and pheomelanin. And remember, we're not breaking down chemical structure today, but what I do want you to look at is the other side of the chart, which is the melanosomes. So now we're starting to get into the little package that the melanin lives in. So remember, melanin is created inside of a melanosome. It's just a little package for it to live in. Eumelanin, you can see looking at the melanosome, it's an oblong shape. So we've got this longer package, the melanosome package. Also, it's obviously darker because we know that eumelanin is that darker color. It also tends to be bigger, and it's hard to gauge size within these microscope photos, but eumelanosomes are bigger than pheomelanosomes. So they're bigger, they're darker, they're oblong. And we're going to review and recap and add on to this in a minute. The pheomelanin, if you look at the bottom, they're obviously a lot lighter. They are a lot smaller as well, we kind of like to think of the size as eumelanosomes are like jelly beans and pheomelanosomes are like flecks of sand. So bigger and oblong versus smaller and round. If you look at the size or the shape, pheomelanosomes are generally round. Now, remember we said that most people will have some kind of combination of both. Most people don't just have all eumelanosomes or all pheomelanosomes. So what you'll generally see is, depending on that client's ethnic background, because that will determine what types of melanosomes they inherit, they're going to have some kind of mix of both. So this is going to vary depending on the client's Fitzpatrick as well. So I'll give you a real world example. I like to use my parents as an example of Fitzpatrick because my mom is a Fitzpatrick 1 and my dad was a Fitzpatrick 6. So let's say, for argument's sake, that the melanosomes at the top were my dad's. Dark skin, Fitzpatrick 6, big, dark, oblong melanosomes. My mom's skin, very light, very fair, tiny little flecks of light colored melanosomes. Now, obviously, when I'm born, I'm going to inherit both of those. So if you're treating my skin, if I'm your client as a Fitzpatrick 4, you want to be aware of, okay, this client has a combination of different types of melanosomes and they're going to react differently to treatment. So start thinking to yourself, how does that affect my treatment? And if you don't know yet, that's fine, because we're going to break down eumelanin and pheomelanin a little bit more. Now, eumelanin alone, without mixing with other types of melanosomes, like we just mentioned, is a brown to black pigment, and there can be various shades. You can have a lighter brown eumelanosome, you can have a darker black melanosome, and that can vary. And remember, that comes from alpha MSH signaling. So remember, alpha MSH stimulates eumelanin production. We already mentioned it's larger than pheomelanin. So remember, thinking of that eumelanin is big jelly beans and pheomelanin is little flecks of sand. We already talked about the shape as well, oblong. And if you look at the image on the top right, you can see the shape of that melanosome. I also highlighted around the outside of the melanosomes. You can see exactly where it begins and ends, because eumelanosomes are also more densely packed than pheomelanosomes. So that red line on the top is the line exactly where the eumelanosome ends. And you can see that melanin is densely packed all the way to the edges. So it's bigger, it's oblong, it's very densely packed with darker melanin. Now, if you look at the image on the bottom, this is someone who has light to medium skin. So notice pheomelanosome is a little more round, so we know that it is pheomelanin. It still looks dark in color because you have to stain it in order to take photos on the microscope lens. But notice where the circle is surrounding the melanosome on this one. It's not all the way packed to the edges. So it's not as densely packed as a eumelanosome. So keep those in mind. The last thing about eumelanin that we'll discuss for today is that it has a higher degree of UV protection. So someone with darker skin is less likely to experience tans and sunburns because there is a degree of UV protection. Now, does that mean you don't have to wear sunscreen if you have dark skin? Of course not. We all need to wear sunscreen. The amount of sun protection you get is very small, but what you'll often notice is if someone has very dark skin, just that tiny little bit of UV protection throughout their entire life means that they might actually appear to age more slowly than someone who has fairer skin, who doesn't have that naturally built-in UV protection. Now, obviously, we all need to wear sunscreen, and you want to find one that works well for your skin tone and blends well. You also want to make sure that your clients are wearing sunscreen every day, because the #1 trigger of alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone is UV. If we're not wearing sunscreen, we're not going to get results. So eumelanin has that little bit of degree of UV protection where pheomelanin does not. Now, remember we said the pheomelanin is the lighter melanin. So this is shades of yellows and reds. And again, this accounts for the variation in skin tone that we have even among very fair skinned people. Somebody might have more warm tones, someone might have more cool tones, and that's attributed to partially to the yellow versus the red pigment within the pheomelanosomes. We also mentioned already that ASP, the Ajouti signaling protein, diverts to the secondary pathway, because remember, eumelanin is what all of our melanocytes want to create. We divert it to create pheomelanin with that different signaler. We also know that that MC1R dysfunction, if there's some kind of defect or just something happening where MC1R isn't working properly, cysteine pops up, we divert to pheomelanin. So pheomelanin is that secondary pathway. We've seen those round melanosomes already, tiny little flecks of sand, so very small, round, light-colored melanosomes. Now, this also oxidizes very easily. So if you're outside and you have very fair skin, if you have come in contact with UV, anything that could create free radical damage or oxidative stress, so pollution, UV, a lot of these things that we come in contact with our skin, it oxidizes, which means we don't get that UV protection that we get from eumelanin. And this is one of the main reasons why people with fair skin tend to get sunburns so quickly and so easily, because there's just absolutely no UV protection on their skin. And you now have this oxidation that's happening, which starts to degrade the structure of your skin. So when that melanin, that pheomelanin oxidizes, you're more likely to burn rather than tan. So someone who's very fair skin, Fitzpatrick 1, someone who has never gotten a tan ever, but they burn every time they go outside, it's due to the oxidation of the pheomelanin. Now, another key thing to note about pheomelanin is that it's much more easily digested than eumelanin. And what we mean by that is if you're using products that help to brighten the skin, pheomelanin can actually brighten more quickly than eumelanin because it's more easily digested. So this is one of the reasons why if you're treating hyperpigmentation in a Fitzpatrick 4, 5, or 6, it might take a little longer. It's going to be a little more difficult because it's more difficult to degrade melanin that already exists in the skin, and it doesn't respond as quickly to some of the ingredients that we use. Does it respond? Yes, absolutely. Especially if you're using tyrosinase inhibitors, it just might take a little longer. It's one of the reasons why we say that treating hyperpigmentation in darker skin is a little bit trickier. You can get amazing results, just might take a little bit longer due to the differences between eumelanin versus pheomelanin. Now let's start to look at the packages that they come in, the melanosomes. And if you have any questions about anything that we talked about so far, please feel free to put that into the Q&A and I'll circle back to it. So the melanosomes, remember we said, are the packages that the melanin come in. We've said in the past, if you've taken some of our other IDI classes, we sometimes say that melanin is created and then it's put into a package. We're going to flip that a little bit. We sometimes simplify it depending on how much time we have in the class. But now that we're doing a deep dive today, we can talk about what actually happens, which is the melanin is synthesized inside of the melanosome. So the melanosome is already there. It has to be built first, then the melanin becomes active within it. And we're actually going to look in a moment at the different stages of how those melanosomes form. So first thing to know about melanosomes is actually a recap, because we've talked about eumelanosomes versus pheomelanosomes. So the different shape package, different shaped melanosome based on the type of melanin inside it. So remember we said that melanosome has to be created first. It's almost like building an empty house. And then once the melanin moves in, houses don't do this in real life, but the melanosome will change structure depending on what the melanin is signaling it to do. And we will look at that more in depth. So we mentioned there's variations in the shape, oblong for eumelanin, round for pheomelanin, variations in size, larger for eumelanin, smaller for pheomelanin. And that's one of the things that contributes to the skin color. Now, another thing that's interesting to note about melanosomes is that their presence is different in darker skin versus lighter skin. So I want you to think of the stratum corneum for a minute. We often say it's like a brick wall, the skin cells being the bricks and the intercellular glue holding them together. Once those bricks start to flatten and they're corneocytes, the dead skin cells in the stratum corneum, if you have lighter skin, those corneocytes do not have any melanosomes present. So when you exfoliate the skin, you're not taking color off of the skin when you exfoliate, because there's actually no color in the stratum corneum. Those melanocytes, or excuse me, those melanosomes are gone. They're not present in the corneocytes, which are those flattened dead skin cells. In darker skin, the corneocytes in the stratum corneum actually still have melanosomes left. So if you exfoliate someone with darker skin, their skin could actually look lighter when you remove the exfoliant because you actually have removed color from the stratum corneum. There were colored melanosomes, Eumelanin melanosomes, in those dead skin cells. So that's just something that's a good information to know when you're choosing exfoliation for your client, knowing the difference between, again, those eumelanosomes and those pheomelanosomes. Now let's start to, sorry, I'm just taking a peek at questions. You're chatting in good questions. I'm actually going to save them until the end because we're close to the end and I want to wrap it all up with your questions. So I want to look at how melanosomes are formed because remember we said that the melanin synthesis happens within the melanosome. So we'll look at the step-by-step progression of melanosome and how that changes based on the different information. Now, first thing I want you to do, I want you to quiz yourself for a second. If you want to chat in, you can. If not, just answer in your head. I want you to just look at the images in the little circles, and I want you to tell me, is this a eumelanosome or is this a pheomelanosome? Based on what we've talked about so far. So look at these images in the circles here next to stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. When we get to stage 4, is it a eumelanosome or a pheomelanosome? I'll give you the answer if you didn't chat in. It's a eumelanosome because remember, darker, oblong, packed to the edge. So let's talk about how this all happened. So when we create melanosomes, the stage 1 is almost just like kind of building the framing of a house. If you look at the image that's in the circle, it's really just a pre-melanosome. It's spherical, regardless of what type of melanin is going to grow inside of it, it's spherical and it's totally empty. It's just an empty house at this point. So that's your pre-melanosome. All of our melanosomes start this way. No melanin in them at all yet. Then they start to get to stage 2, and this is starting to lay down the matrix. So I kind of like to think of this as laying down the floorboards, which creates striations in the melanosome. So this is like laying floorboards down in that empty house that we just built. There's still no melanin yet, but the proteins that are present so far in that empty melanosome are starting to reinforce the structure, building those striations that are laying the floorboards down. Still no melanin so far. We built the framing of the house, we laid the floorboards down. So now we have this beautiful empty house. When we move to stage 3, this is when we start to have a little bit of melanin creation. Now, so far, we've seen a spherical pre-melanosome. Notice that stage 2 got kind of oblong. This shape will change back and forth depending on what information we give it. So all melanosomes, regardless of what color is going to end up inside of them, what type of melanin is going to end up inside of them, they're spherical, they're oblong, they're spherical, they're oblong. They don't make up their mind until they get that melanin creation. So in stage 3, this is where we start to have tyrosinase activity. So remember, tyrosinase is always present, not always active. If we don't have a lot of active tyrosinase, we're probably going to end up with a pheomelanosome. If we have a receptor defect, we might end up with a pheomelanosome. If, however, that tyrosinase is very active, which is what's happening here in this, this kind of walkthrough that we're looking at, we start to partially create that melanin so far. So tyrosinase is activated. Remember, we added sugar through glycosylation. Now it's really active. It interacts with the tyrosine, and that's where we're at so far with stage 3. So we're slowly building this up. Now, stage 4, we complete the melanin process. So we've already done that first tyrosinase equation, which remember is the same for everyone, no matter what the type of melanin is. Then for this particular melanosome, we went down the primary pathway and created eumelanin. The primary pathway or the final pathway, whichever direction it goes in, happens during stage 4 of this melanosome development. So for this one, we went through the primary pathway. We created an oblong eumelanosome, which is densely packed with dark pigment. And that's the life cycle of that melanosome. Now, once that happens, we're still not done. We still can't actually see this color yet because this is all the way in the basal layer of our skin. We can't see that layer. So after this, what happens is that fully melanized melanosome, going back to our hand being the melanocyte, that melanosome's been created. It now starts to travel through the dendrites, or those finger-like projections of the melanocyte, following that delivery route all the way out. Once we get to the end of the delivery route, delivered into the skin cell. Your skin cell, just like all of us when we get a package, we open the package, your skin cell opens that melanin package, and then the 28-day cell turnover process begins. And if you've taken any of our IDI aging classes, you know that most of us aren't actually taking 28 days anymore. It's probably taking a little longer. So this is a long process from the second we create a melanosome to the second we actually see that color on the surface of the skin. It's a very long process. And I want to call your attention to the image on the left side of the screen, which we haven't talked about, which is showing what the skin looks like after that delivery and travel happens for darker skin versus lighter skin. So let's start on the right hand. Actually, let's start on the left hand side first, because there's more to look at over here. You see that hyperactive melanocyte, so lots of tyrosinase activity, which we know means probably is going to lead to darker skin. That melanocyte delivers lots of little melanosomes to the skin cells. And notice as we start to go up, you're seeing those little melanosomes, they start to kind of fade away a little bit. But if you notice on the stratum corneum, which is again, all of those packed corneocytes, see how there's still color in those. And remember we said darker skin retains melanosomes within the corneocytes. So this is someone that has darker skin on the left-hand side of this image here. On the right-hand side, if we start looking at the melanosome, we don't see as much activity. You would still see something like this happening, it would just be lighter and smaller. And then when we get all the way up to the stratum corneum, you don't see any color in those corneocytes or in those dead skin cells. So that's kind of how the melanosome development would feed into the skin cells and change someone's, well, I shouldn't say change, but determine someone's skin color and how their skin appears to our eye as we're looking at it. So that's the development of the melanosome, and then again, how that feeds into the cell turnover process when we actually start to see that color on the skin. You won't really see the color that's been created by that melanocyte until it gets higher up in the skin. So for that reason, you have to be patient sometimes when you're treating hyperpigmentation. You can start to get results within a few days if you're using really great ingredients. But if we're going to the source and we're using tyrosinase inhibitors and other types of ingredients, which I saw there was a question, I will give you some tips about types of ingredients to look for as well. If we're going to the source all the way at the melanocyte, we have to wait for those cells to get closer to the surface of the skin before we can really see the benefit of the products and the ingredients that we've been using. So hyperpigmentation is not something that we can just clear overnight because of the cellular processes that have to happen in order for us to even see the melanin that's been created. So again, you can start to get very good results very quickly, but it's not something that you're going to cure overnight entirely. We have to tell our clients to be a little bit patient. So let's go back and recap what we talked about and see how it fits into the melanogenesis process. And then what I want you to think about now, since we've kind of talked about the pieces of it, is how do I hack the system? And I like to use the term hack the system to say, how do I just undo this thing? So starting with melanocyte signaling. Remember we said that MC1R receptor, we all have it on our melanocyte cells. We also have those two molecules that signal melanin. So the alpha MSH signals the eumelanin, which, by the way, another fun fact, if you are someone who is tanning, even if you get an accidental tan outside, UV stimulates alpha MSH, which stimulates eumelanin, which is why even someone with fair skin, if you tan, you're going to get darker, not redder, because the eumelanin is what is stimulated. So remember we said eumelanin can be various shades of brown. Someone who's a Fitzpatrick 2 with a tan has browner skin because there's been more melanin produced. Now, that being said, don't tan, wear your sunscreen. So thinking of how we can hack the system for melanocyte signaling. If we have a client who we know is tanning, is not wearing sunscreen, maybe there's inflammation present, maybe inflammation from breakouts, which leads, we know, to that post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. Maybe it's sensitivity inflammation. If we can try to figure out what is sending the signal, if we can remove the signal, you're going to get better results. So things like inflammation we mentioned are a trigger. So using products designed for sensitive skin, something with anti-inflammatory properties, actually can help pigmentation, especially in higher Fitzpatrick's, because inflammation is actually a bigger trigger for higher Fitzpatrick's versus lower Fitzpatrick's. If it's sun exposure, we got to get them a sunscreen, something they enjoy wearing on their skin that feels comfortable for them. Finding a sunscreen that maybe is oil-free for someone who has acne, or something that is physical, like zinc-based for someone who might have some sensitivity. Just finding a sunscreen that works for them removes that UV melanocyte trigger. So that's another option. We talk more about that in the upcoming class, which again, you'll be able to take maybe summer or fall, which is the IDI pigmentation class. Now going into the melanin synthesis. So we've been signaled. If we're going into that synthesis, we know that there's a eumelanin pathway. We know that there's a pheomelanin pathway. We know that tyrosinase is a part of both of that. So this is where the tyrosinase inhibitors come in as that way to hack the system. So as tyrosinase inhibitors, we want to make sure, and again, I will give you some ideas for ingredients, but we want to make sure that we're targeting something that focuses in that melanocyte cell, something that can take that tyrosinase away, inhibit its activation so that we don't form an overproduction of tyrosinase, which means an overproduction of melanin. And again, remember, someone's natural skin color, that is ingrained in your DNA. Our products are not going to change that. We're looking for products that are going to, or tyrosinase inhibitors, I should say, that are going to inhibit the excess production of melanin. So that way we're bringing it down to match your natural skin color. We're not going to try to change a client's natural skin color. Then we talked about the stages of melanosome development. Now, we can't go in and stop a melanosome from developing. That's a process that's going to happen. We know the melanin is going to be created within it unless we can hack the system earlier on and prevent that signaling. But what we also can think of as far as ingredients is, remember that delivery. So the melanosome travels down the delivery route and it gets delivered into the keratinocyte. What if you could intercept that delivery? So knowing that part of the scientific breakdown now has us thinking, okay, well, are there ingredients that could inhibit melanosome transfer or melanosome delivery? So this is how we start to hack the system. And the way I like to think of this is we're zooming in really close and we're looking at a lot of this science. Once we break this down, zoom back out and think, okay, well, do I have products that have tyrosinase inhibitors in them? Do I need to find some? Do I have products that are going to help to interrupt melanosome transfer, or do I need to add that in? Because if we can target multiple sites of hyperpigmentation, if we focus on signaling and tyrosinase and melanosome transfer, you're more likely to see faster results because we're targeting multiple angles and not just one. So I hope that is helpful, and I hope that comes together. Now, I did see some questions come in, so bear with me as I scroll back a little bit because you all had some really good questions. And what we'll do is we'll kind of clarify anything we talked about because we did a lot of science very quickly. So I want to make sure that this kind of clicks and that we feel comfortable bringing this to clients. So first thing I wanted to answer was Crystal's question, which was what ingredients should we be looking to recommend for tyrosinase inhibitors? When you're looking for an ingredient that is a tyrosinase inhibitor, one of the most effective ones is called hexyl resorcinol. Hexyl resorcinol works to inhibit the amount of tyrosinase and the activity of tyrosinase, and it's a very potent inhibitor. So hexyl resorcinol is a really great ingredient to look for. You can find this in serums. Sometimes you'll see it in night creams or even moisturizers that have SPF in them. So that way you're kind of around the clock. You have 2 products a day on the skin, daytime and nighttime, that are helping to inhibit tyrosinase. Also diglucosyl gallic acid, which is not an ingredient you'll find in a lot of products, but when you do find it, it's a beautiful ingredient that not only inhibits tyrosinase, but it works with your skin's own microbiome to brighten the skin. So it kind of works from a couple different directions. Peony flower extract also is a tyrosinase inhibitor. Vitamin C, we love vitamin C. Just make sure you have stable vitamin C so they can actually reach the melanocyte, because some vitamin C's degrade as they come in contact with the skin, and then the melanocytes don't get them. Another thing is lactic acid at 5% and above acts as a tyrosinase inhibitor as well. And lactic's actually a good double duty for treating hyperpigmentation, because not only does it inhibit tyrosinase, but it also is exfoliating. And we have to slough off all of those older hyperpigmented cells before we can bring up all of those new bright ones that we've been stimulating so far. So lactic acid is a great one to have maybe your client using at home as a cleanser or in an exfoliant. And definitely it's great in the treatment room. If you're giving peels, using a high percentage of lactic acid in your peels is going to be really effective for treating hyperpigmentation. If you're giving peels in the treatment room and using tyrosinase inhibitors, and they're using tyrosinase inhibitors in home in their home care, you're going to get much faster, much more satisfying results. So Georgette's question is, treating hyperpigmentation on dark complexions, Fitzpatrick 6. What are we looking for in treatment? And will treatments be longer versus an individual with Fitzpatrick 4 and lower? So this is a really good question, because remember we said Eumelanin is not as soluble as pheomelanin. Pheomelanin absorbs a lot more product and will kind of break down a little more easily. So your clients with higher Fitzpatricks, generally 4, 5, and 6, it might take a little longer to get results, but you can absolutely use the exact same type of treatments, because remember we said that tyrosinase equation is the same for all of us, no matter what your skin tone is. You want to be cautious though, because higher Fitzpatricks are more likely to have hyperpigmentation as a side effect of treatment. And what that means is if you got too aggressive with your peels, we don't recommend aggressive treatments, but progressive treatments. If you got really aggressive and gave someone a strong peel that really their skin was not ready for, that's going to create inflammation. Inflammation stimulates the alpha melanocyte hormone, or alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, which leads to more pigmentation, and we've now worsened the problem. So when you're treating your higher Fitzpatricks, you can use the same types of ingredients, same types of treatments. Focus on anti-inflammatories as well. So add in some anti-inflammatory ingredients. Maybe space your treatments out a little farther. If you're doing high percentage peels, maybe do them every 3 to 4 weeks for your Fitzpatrick 6 versus your every 2 weeks for your Fitzpatrick's 2. So those are suggestions, just options. Choose based on your client's skin analysis, whatever you find when you're doing their skin analysis. If there's someone who's prone to pigmentation and prone to inflammation, you want to take some of those additional precautions of adding anti-inflammatories into the treatment and into their home care. It's not a bad idea to sneak in products that help with sensitivity when you're treating pigmentation in high Fitzpatrick clients, because inflammation, in general, for all of us, inflammation leads to pigmentation. But once you start at Fitzpatrick 4, 5, and 6, it happens a lot faster. So anti-inflammatories will be your best friend. I do see a question. I'm actually going to chat this into the chat box, because Desiree asked if I could spell the names of those terribly long ingredients that I just mentioned. And I will do that. And I will hope that I spell them correctly. The first one is hexylresorcinol, which I just chatted in. That was a tyrosinase inhibitor. And I'm trying to spell diglucosyl gallic acid. If you Google that and it corrects your spelling, trust Google, not me. Okay, so I see another question looking at peels. TCA cannot be used on darker complexion, but is better on lighter skin. However, this is adding on to our talking about peels. Georgette says, however, I've used a TCA peel from a different brand on darker complexion, and it works faster than glycolic. So when it comes to TCA, if you work with peels, TCA is generally not recommended for high Fitzpatricks, and that's something that's kind of an industry standard. TCA is usually reserved for Fitzpatricks 1, 2, and 3. Some brands will even tell you or even put it on the bottle what Fitzpatricks this is safe for. Some brands and some formulations may be safer for higher Fitzpatricks, or generally a lower percentage of TCA. Always go back to your manufacturer instructions. If you're using a brand and they have a very active peel with a very high percentage of TCA, you want to use caution or avoid that for your clients with higher Fitzpatricks. Again, only because inflammation is more likely in higher Fitzpatricks, which means pigmentation is more likely. So it could potentially lead to additional pigmentation in the skin. Now, I think I'm checking the time. I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'm just scrolling back up. Sorry, I missed, everybody was asking me to spell those ingredients. I apologize, I missed that one. Okay, so I think there was a hypopigmentation question. So remember we were talking about hypopigmentation versus hyper. Hyper, we know, is the creating of too much melanin. Hypo, remember we said melanin really just isn't being created. So if we're looking at someone who has hypopigmentation, I'm going to kind of paraphrase the question. I've been treating pigment disorder with an antifungal cream instead of tyrosinase inhibitors, and I'm getting some interesting results. So the question is there a link there? Hypopigmentation can be caused by different things. So remember we said with someone who has albinism or vitiligo, that is a dead melanocyte, and that generally happens with overstimulation of melanocytes as well. So if we're giving those really strong peels that maybe the client's not ready for, or if we've been tanning for 40 or 50 years, that melanocyte just dies. So tyrosinase can't exist anymore because it lives in the melanocyte. However, some hypopigmentation can be fungal. Tinea versicolor is a skin disorder, so it's technically outside of our scope of practice. We would refer to a dermatologist for this. But tinea versicolor is a skin disorder that is a fungal infection that temporarily damages melanocytes. So if you are treating someone with tinea versicolor, their dermatologist might recommend they use antifungal creams, and that could be very effective. Antifungal creams will only be effective for fungus-based hypopigmentation, which is a skin disorder, is much more rare. It's not something we would work into our treatment. Oh, Revleen has a good question. Is there a perfect product to get rid of hyperpigmentation? I wish there were. What you can do, we can't get perfect because we can't guarantee 100% that we can get rid of someone's hyperpigmentation. Once that melanocyte has been programmed to overproduce melanin, it's going to do that for the rest of its life until we tell it to stop, which is why it's so important to start working these products into home care. So we can't just 100% change how that melanocyte functions, but the best way, the closest to perfect we can get, it's not going to be one product, it's going to be targeting multiple sites of hyperpigmentation. So that means the signaling, reducing the signaling as much as possible. That includes anti-inflammatories, which is going to reduce signal. Antioxidants, because free radicals and oxidative stress are also going to signal. So these are things we can work in. Tyrosinase inhibitors, exfoliants to slough off the excess hyperpigmentation that's already on the skin. And one ingredient I actually forgot to mention earlier is niacinamide. Niacinamide we often use for acne, and it's great for acne, but a bonus of niacinamide is that it also, going back to my melanocyte cell, it inhibits melanosome transfer. So if you're using tyrosinase inhibitors, that's preventing melanin production here, but what if some of it sneaks through and it makes it all the way down to the delivery route? Well, niacinamide intercepts it here. So we're targeting from both angles. So if you can do that, plus reduce signaling by using anti-inflammatories and antioxidants, you're going to get really good results. Now, I wish I had one perfect product or ingredient, but it has to be a combination of all these things. And if you want to learn more about the ingredients, because this obviously was a shorter webinar and we dug into the skin physiology side of things, if you want more information about the ingredient side of things as well, keep your eye out for the new pigmentation class that's coming from IDI later this year. Okay, I think that was just about everything. If there are any questions that we didn't get to answer today, I apologize because we're limited on time. You can always feel free to reach out to us on the Dermal Institute Instagram page, and we'll be happy to answer your questions there. And be sure to watch the recording as well, which Celeste is going to give us more info about, because this is a lot of info, and we're probably going to want to watch it again to let it all dive in.
So true. I told you guys, it's going to be a lot, but very, very exciting times. Thank you so much, Kristina, for breaking it down for us and making it extremely digestible to understand.